Well, it finally happened. After a long and happy life, Miss Thelma's beloved Lhasa Apso, whom she named Vidalia, finally crossed over the Rainbow Bridge. It's a sad thing, when your dog dies. Some of you have been through that, I know. Well, people get really close to their dogs these days. They're like part of the family, so it made sense to Miss Thelma to make arrangements for a funeral at church. So she called up the Baptist church, where she was the chair of the Women's Auxiliary and the vice director of Sunday school, and she said, "Preacher, I want to have a memorial for Vidalia, my dog. He was just so precious to me." And that Baptist preacher said, "I'm really sorry for your loss, Miss Thelma, but we just can't hold a funeral service for your dog no matter how precious he was. Theologically, practically, it just doesn't make sense." But I'll tell you what, that pastor said, there's this other church over in the East End. They're like United or Unitarian or maybe MCC, one of those sort of liberal churches, probably has a lesbian pastor. And I bet you that they would go in for something like that. "Okay," said Thelma, I guess I'll have to give that a try. And, well, preacher, can you help me with one other thing? I've never done anything like this before, and so I don't know anything about how much it ought to cost. I know that these services for people can get really expensive. My brother-in-law died last year, and it cost my sister something like $20,000. So I was thinking for a dog, maybe I would cut that in half and give that East End church $10,000. "Why, Miss Thelma," the preacher said, "why in the world didn't you tell me that your dog was Baptist?" Let's pray together. Blessed are you, eternal one, our God, ruler of time and space, who's kept us alive and sustained us and helped us to arrive at this moment. Amen. So when I read that joke, it was about a Catholic priest and a dog owner named Muldoon, not Miss Thelma. That didn't really feel like my lane, though, so I went ahead and made a few edits to make it a little closer to home. One more, real quick. Man dies, and believe it or not, finds himself standing in line at the pearly gates, waiting to talk to St. Peter about getting into heaven. He's pretty sure he's going to get in, but he can't help but be a little anxious. Any one of us would be in that situation, and a little curious, and so when it's almost his turn, he starts to kind of lean in and listen to the people ahead of him to see what St. Peter's saying to them. He sees this woman come up to the gate, and St. Peter says to her, "Well, what denomination were you?" And she says, "Well, I was Methodist. My grandmother was a Methodist." "Very good," Peter says. "So what you're going to want to do is follow the green sign straight down that corridor. You're going to make a left, and you're going to go to a sign, big sign that says Suite 117. You can't miss it. And listen, on your way, you really got to keep it down. Don't make any noise when you pass that big door on the right, okay?" Woman agrees. She says, okay. She's off to paradise. Man comes up next. Peter asks the same question. "What denomination were you?" "I was Eastern Orthodox." "Wonderful," Peter says, gives them directions that are pretty much the same, except it's a different suite number, 112 or something, and then he says the same thing as before. You got to keep it quiet when you pass that first big door on the right, and so off he goes. And finally, it's the man's turn with St. Peter. Turns out this man was a Presbyterian, and it turns out that the Presbyterians are in suite number 121, and again, Peter says to him, you got to keep quiet when you pass that first big door on the right. "Well, sure thing," the man says, but I got to know, why do you keep telling people to be quiet when you pass that first big door on the right? "Oh, right," Peter says, "people are always asking about that. So that's the Southern Baptists, and bless their hearts, they think they're the only ones up here." There are so many flavors of Christian, aren't there? It can be hard to keep them sorted, even for those of us who know our way around the church. I myself was born into one Baptist denomination, worked for a second Baptist denomination when I became a full-time pastor, joined another Baptist denomination, that's 3 in case you're keeping up, when I landed here in Canada. And then 5 years ago, just before I started working here at MCC, I talked to folks from 3 other denominations about the possibility of going to work in one of those churches. Of course, I ended up here, thank God, in this really wonderful global denomination that's full of churches like ours, where everyone comes from a different church background. Now, if you're having trouble keeping up with all this, Say a prayer of thanksgiving to God for the soundness of your mind, because no rational, and dare I say normal, person has any business walking around with all this sectarian trivia cluttering your mind. Besides that, the big arc of Christian history has carried us to a place and a time when the reasons that one denomination needed to separate and distinguish itself from another are irrelevant, if not archaic. Now, some of my Protestant ancestors got themselves thrown into prison, or worse, for insisting that we baptize only consenting adult believers and not infants. Well, here in 2026, I will baptize your infant in a heartbeat. Just let me hold your baby, please. I'll baptize an adult too. I'll sprinkle drops of water from the font, or I will shove your whole body into Lake Ontario. Not on February 1st, but you get the idea. And see, I'm a minister. I am burdened by my profession with an above-average understanding of denominational distinctives. But for most lay people sitting out in the pews, the question isn't, can I align myself with the Eucharistic theology of this church? Or are these Westminster Confession people? Or are they New Hampshire Confession people? It's, how's the music? Do they have a nursery? Or is the pastor going to let us out early enough to get a good table at Sambuca's for brunch? Now, this is not to say that there aren't substantial differences between churches in this day and age. I think we know better. Maybe denominational affiliation doesn't mean what it used to, but there are still just about as many kinds of churches as there are Christians in the world. And as much as we might like to chalk up the differences to arguments and councils and reformers that were 500 years ago or more, or to suggest that it's mostly things like worship preferences and style, I think the world that we're living in has started stripping that illusion away. Because when I look around, when I scroll through my newsreels, when I read headlines, it seems to me that there's really just one dividing line, one ideological border separating two types of churches and two types of Christians. And on one side of that line, there are professing followers of Jesus that think it is acceptable for a paramilitary force to violently take civilian lives with no real accountability. And then there are Christians that think that is not okay. There are churches that pray for God to cut off evildoers when those so-called evildoers are immigrant families who've lived and worked and paid taxes and raised children in their communities for years. And there are churches that refuse to call cruelty holy. There are Christians that have no problem being led by a pastor with a side gig working for ICE, and Christians that are taking to the streets to protest ICE and to protest fascism and tyranny and white supremacy. There are Christians that have decided that mercy is not worth preaching about and that empathy is a sin, and there are Christians that still believe God is love and that compassion is the beating heart of the gospel. Now, at this point, it would probably be pretty easy for us to say, well, at least we know which side we're on. And it would be pretty easy to point fingers and call names and push back, because resistance, protest, is a response that is absolutely appropriate and needed. But then there's something specific that we like to say sometimes when we speak out against the harm being carried out by professing Christians. What we say sometimes is, well, that's not real Christianity. Those aren't real Christians. Have you found yourself saying something like that when you encountered so-called Christians being hateful, spreading homophobia or transphobia, or being anti-women or anti-people of color or anti-immigrant or anti-empathy or anti-mercy? Those aren't real Christians. You know, I get it. That feels like a perfectly reasonable response, but I don't think it's that easy. I don't think we get to just say, yeah, that's all fake, and act like that's the end of it. You see, I think that when it comes to the public expression of our faith, if you profess Christianity, then you're a Christian. If you think that empathy is a sin, and you don't welcome immigrants, and you have no interest in feeding the hungry, and you call yourself a Christian, then you are a Christian. You might be a harmful Christian, you might be a dangerous Christian, but you're not a fake one. Now, Some folks might object to that idea on theological grounds. You might be thinking about doctrines and confessions and who really belongs, and you might be thinking of the time that Jesus said, "You'll know them by their fruit," or "Not everyone who calls out to me will enter the kingdom." And sure, I'll give you that. But what I'm talking about here is more material than theoretical. I'm not talking about how God sees the heart or how redemption ultimately works or who winds up where in what we like to call eternity. If there is to be some final reckoning, some separation of wheat from chaff or sheep from goats, well, our scriptures remind us again and again that that work doesn't belong to us and it doesn't belong to this age. Now, what does belong to us right here and right now in 2026 is being honest with ourselves about what Christianity has been used to justify in the real world. Not in theory, not in denominational committees or assemblies, but at borders and in prisons and out on the streets from Birmingham to Minneapolis to right here in Toronto. This is not a new phenomenon. It's not just a 21st century thing. We can learn from the words of prophets like Jeremiah or early church leaders like Paul that our faith tradition has a long history of being co-opted and hijacked by destructive people who've learned to speak the language of God. In the passage that I read, the prophet Jeremiah condemns his people for using God's name and God's temple to create a refuge. Not for the vulnerable, not for the stranger, not for the poor, a refuge for dangerous, exploitative, violent people. It's a tough passage. It's where we get the word Jeremiah from, because Jeremiah had really harsh things to say to the church. And some of us have heard parts of this passage before, especially that passage we might have heard translated as a den of thieves, I'm not so sure that's really the point that Jeremiah is trying to make, though. I don't know if that's the best translation. Den of thieves, to me, kind of sounds quaint, like a hideout where pirates hang out to count their loot. In our individualistic, capitalist Western context, it is no surprise that our translators would have us believe that the prophets are chiefly concerned with upholding personal property rights. But the word that Jeremiah uses here means something closer to destroyer. Somebody who breaks something, someone who does violence, and not just small-scale violence, though that's certainly part of it. One possible translation here is actually tyrants. 2,500 years ago, Jeremiah is saying not that his people are fake when it comes to faith, but that their religious spaces are being used to shed violent and exploitative people from accountability, that the temple is being used to protect and embolden tyrants. And by the way, Jesus knew that well enough to repeat those very same words that Jeremiah had said when he flipped over the tables in the temple courtyard. And even St. Paul, through the struggles that he faced in his ministry, had the perception to say that the church was in danger of being twisted, not by outsiders, but by the church's own people. He had seen it happen before. He understood that it was going to keep happening. And so it is. Our history shows us again and again and again that faith, Christianity in particular, is dangerously easy to hijack. Time after time, nearly every societal ill we can name, from patriarchy and white supremacy to homophobia and transphobia, from systems that impoverish and exclude migrants to war and genocide, every one of these things has been strengthened and legitimized by Christian dogma. And it's not just something that's happened some other time and someplace else. It's not just happening down in the States. It's happening right here in the GTA. Right now, this morning, there's a family of people who came to Canada as refugees and were settled about an hour from here. They reached out to us a little while ago. They were brought to Canada by a faith community, by a church. Lots of churches do that work. We've done that work here. Now, the church that sponsored them was their lifeline. It was the community that they relied on for rides to the grocery store and for help getting to the doctor and for all kinds of support, the kind of support that newcomers almost always need. But then the family's adult son came out as gay. And all that support was pulled right out from under them. And so this family's lives began to collapse into isolation and extreme need, into something that looks a lot more like a refugee camp on the other side of the world than a town right here in the Toronto area. Now imagine sitting down with that family and saying, who did this? Who hurt you? I can promise you that they're not going to parse denominational distinctions with you. They're not going to dive into theology, and they're not going to have any patience for anybody who does. All they know is that they are hurting, and Christians did this to them. So, if we were to respond by saying, well, those aren't real Christians, doesn't heal anything. Doesn't undo the harm, doesn't make that church that did that to them and the churches like it, doesn't make them disappear or lose their influence. All that kind of thinking does is it tries to soothe us and tries to help us avoid confronting something that makes us really uncomfortable. That kind of thinking erases accountability, not to mention the fact that it gaslights folks that have been wounded by the church. There are way too many wounded people out there. And the truth is, far too many of those wounds have been inflicted by church-going Christians. And we cannot confront that truth if we refuse to acknowledge and humbly accept it. If we're not willing to be honest about it, we risk becoming complicit, helping to make that den of thieves, that hiding place for those who destroy, an even safer refuge than it already is. So what do we do with all this? Well, mainly we tell the truth. We resist the temptation to pretend that Christianity, that the church is only ever what we say it is and what we want it to be. We stop saying, well, those aren't real Christians, and we start saying, well, this is what Christianity gets used for, and we can see it happening. Because the work before us is not to sort who's real and who's not. That work belongs to God. The work before us is in constantly asking ourselves what kind of church we will be, who's hiding here, what's hiding here, and what our own offering will be to the broader faith and to our world. Will we do something and say something? When Christianity is used as a shield to protect the powerful, will we resolve to be a shelter for the vulnerable? Will our faith excuse or ignore cruelty, or will we do all we can to interrupt it? Amen.